Well, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to join you again. I was here a couple of years ago, and I'm glad to be back. Bring you greetings from lovely Baltimore, Maryland today. I'm going to start a share and get my stuff up. Great. Okay, so what I want to talk with you about today is the collision between science and spirituality and how Judaism and other religions deal with the problem of infertility and its treatment. I'm used to teaching in medical settings, and we're always required to make sure that we disclose that we have nothing to disclose, or if we do, that we do have something to disclose. So I have nothing to disclose today. I won't be trying to sell you anything. Um, and there are a couple of takeaways, hopefully at the end of this talk, and there will be some back and forth and room for that. You'll be able to talk about how multiple religions view reproduction and talk about which forms of ART, that's assisted reproductive technology, are acceptable to which religion. So let's start, because we are talking about today, Shavuot, the receiving of Torah. And very early on, we find out that reproduction is a very important commandment. Genesis 1:28, and God blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And we're going to see this repeated multiple times, especially early on. So a couple of Jewish thoughts on this. I just gave you that one quote. And then again, after the flood, God makes it very clear to Noah and his sons that they are to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth now that the earth has been essentially wiped out of human life. And if we think about God and his personality, Jack Miles, who wrote a wonderful book several years ago, probably 25 years ago, called God, a Biography, makes it very clear that very much so in Genesis, God is a creator, and he wants us to be creators as well. And so fertility is critical to the Jewish story. And because Judaism is the springboard for both Christianity and Islam, by extension, fertility is critical to all three of the Abrahamic religions. And we will see it has a very important role in other religious traditions as well. Formation of a family becomes very important. It is in the family, in relation to the family, that religion is practiced more than anywhere else. So all religions have something to say about the creation of family. And in fact, without reproduction, survival of the religion does not exist, and failure is quite likely to take place. And there are religions which have not promoted fertility, which have not promoted reproduction, and you can't name them because they don't exist anymore. And we see this in our text many times. Rachel cries out to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. How much more powerful a statement can we get than that? And then one of my favorites, Hannah prays to God. She's barren, and her husband's other wife has had children, and she says, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give me a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. And she does eventually have a child, and he becomes the priest Samuel. And in the process, her husband comes up and says, am I not more dear to you than 10 sons? Forgetting that being a mother, having a child, is so important in the life of a woman. We will see that the tradition many traditions don't really talk about the life of the father, other than that he is the force which has created the child, but we don't hear how he feels when he's not unable to. When we listen to the story of Abraham and Sarah's inability to conceive, we hear about her and how she feels. We don't really know how Abraham feels. Um, but we do know later on that after Hagar has borne Ishmael to him, and Sarah realizes that she really can't handle another woman having a child being raised in her home, she asks for Hagar and Ishmael to be removed from the community, and they are. Um, there is a wonderful article by a fellow by name Dutney, and he talks about how various religions view fertility. And he says, in reporting on South African religions, to the extent that she is unable to enter into this commerce, that is, of having a child with the ancestors, the infertile woman loosens the whole community's ties to the ancestors and weakens the protections those ties offer, so that the ability to create linkage to the past and create linkage, therefore, to the future is critical in multiple religions, not just Judaism.
Do you mean to be sharing in presenter view so we can see your next slide?
No, I really don't. I wonder how I can change that.
No worries. Just keep screen. You can keep screen sharing. Just exit the full screen slideshow.
Where am I? Give me a hint. Where are my display settings?
Yeah, try that. You can try that.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to be
You're
this.
totally fine. You're totally fine.
Okay, there
Um,
we go. There we go.
yeah.
Okay. All right. So I appreciate that. Sorry to have distracted everybody. Um, um, so how does Hinduism take a look at the notion of fertility? Dharma, which is righteous conduct or duty, which is a very important concept in the Hindu faith, takes a collective rather than individual view of human identity. So family formation has a very powerful place, and especially when you consider that generations are linked through reincarnation as well. So for a woman, the height of Dharma is being a good householder, a wife, and a mother. And for a man, fathering and providing for children, especially male children, because that's how tradition is passed on, that's how property is passed on, is the primary duty he owes his wider family. But raising those children, not so much. That job is being a mother. So tremendous, not only power given to women, but tremendous responsibility placed on women for fertility. And because most of these writings are multiple thousands of years ago, it clearly was before the science of fertility was well understood. And in particular, the role of the man and his sperm was appreciated for the 50% nature that it holds. The Quran, God creates what he pleases. He grants to whom he pleases female, and he grants to whom he pleases males. He gives them in pairs, males and females. He makes whom he pleases barren. Verily, he is knowing and powerful. So, infertility comes from God. Infertility comes from Allah. And therefore, one must assume if you are not fertile, you have done something to displease God. Now, Christianity does a very interesting thing with fertility. The New Testament, Christian Bible, ventures into questions of marriage, and it's very powerful in the way it looks at the pros and cons of marriage. And in multiple citations, um, the New Testament says that the single life and childlessness might be more important and closer to God than having a family or by extension, being fertile. So who is the closest to God? The closest to God are the priests, and they are not to have children, they are to remain celibate. And the next in that line would be nuns who have also chosen to be married to God or to Jesus, depending upon your interpretation of the text. So it says in some ways that an unfertile Christian couple may have been chosen by God and to deny them the privilege of children for the sake of some other higher calling. And so when questions to what is God calling them, because he's denied them the vocation of parenthood, this is troubling on so many levels, but it is part of the tradition. So faiths that involve karma, Hinduism and Buddhism, they're all of these important life events, and we're talking about infertility or fertility here, are an outworking of this karmic cycle. Infertility is seen as the result of something you did wrong, such as you mistreated or aborted a child in a previous incarnation, and so karma visits infertility on you in this generation. Um, and it's a penalty for having done ill, having done wrong. It's another type of crisis by people in this religious tradition. And it's the longing for children is one of the desires keeping them trapped in a cycle of reincarnation. A little bit more about karma. It's an idea that our thoughts, words, and actions have consequences. You reap what you sow, if you will, and it shapes present and future experiences and therefore shapes future generation. So there is a suggestion that this is cause and effect. If you do good, something good will happen to you. And if you do bad, something bad will happen to you and the generations that follow you. And we get a little bit of this in our text, but not to the extent that we're thinking about reincarnation. So the other thing that I think is important here is that Buddhism says suffering is the core of human experience. All life has suffering in it. Hinduism also acknowledges suffering, but it's a natural part of life and it's potentially resulting from karma or the unfolding of the divine will. But that suffering is going to be there. You don't have a choice about that. And both of these traditions say there's a way to overcome suffering. Um, Buddhism says a lot of suffering is the result of attachment. We are attached to things or we attach to people and ignorance. And Hinduism says the path to liberation through karma is through liberation through karma and righteous actions. So you will be freed of suffering if you behave in a way that is righteous. Now, this isn't an unknown concept in Judaism to behave in a righteous way, but in Hinduism and Buddhism to some extent, this is the way to a higher level of life. So I want to shift gears. We talked about some of the foundational aspects of fertility, infertility, with regard to religious traditions and beliefs, but I now want to make it more about infertility and the treatment of infertility from technological points of view is relatively young. It's 141 years. The first artificial insemination that took place and produced a human child was in 1884, and it took place at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. Um, the woman was told nothing about being artificially inseminated. She was put to sleep, and the physician in charge of the treatment told everyone, including the husband, that it should never be discussed that a donor was used to produce this child. And there are multiple reasons why this was determined. The reason we know about it is that 25 years later, an article was published describing what took place. And it suggested that one could inseminate artificially and maintain secrecy throughout the life of the child. Everyone was told, don't tell anyone. Now, today we know that the notion of secrecy is impossible because of Ancestry.com, the internet, and the discovery of DNA and genetic codes. But for many years, someone who used a donor was told never tell the child. Now, we think very differently about that today because we believe it's important for multiple reasons, not the least of which is that a child should have access to medical information so they can do a better job of taking care of themselves. The first IVF, in vitro fertilization, where an embryo was created outside of the womb with a sperm and an egg, which were retrieved from a man and a woman and put together in a petri dish, took place in 1978, and that was in England. The first IVF that took place in the United States was 3 years later, 1981, and that took place in Northern Virginia. If you are interested in the history of IVF, there's a wonderful Netflix film called Joy, The History of IVF, which takes a look at not only the physicians and scientists who were involved in the creation of the first baby, but the nurse who sort of held them all together and was the glue that got the process through the 10 years it took for it to come to fruition. And I highly recommend it because it's historically accurate and gives you some of the some insights into what it really took to do this. Something today we consider to be relatively normal. IVF has a remarkable way of reporting outcomes mandated by law. 1992, the Wyden Act required that all IVF clinics report their outcomes, and the data is verified. And for medical specialties, this is an unusual process. So, for example, in 2023, the last year for which there is verified data, there were over 78,000 babies born from IVF across the country, which is a remarkable number when you start to think about it. So let's go back and talk a little bit more. I'm going to come back to IVF in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about how infertility may be experienced. And these are some concepts which are spread across, some consistent across religions, some skipping around. But a religious duty, procreation is a religious duty in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Judaism. We are commanded to be fruitful and multiply. And the more religious you are, it's possible the more children you have, certainly in Judaism. And the notion that infertility is imposed by God is not everywhere. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, yes. Karma in the karmic religions, Buddhism and Hinduism, a punishment for wrongdoing could be seen that way by all 5 of these religions. And does it point to a higher calling? Well, Christianity has a way of bending it so that it could be that it leads to a higher calling. Doesn't necessarily have to do that. Third-party reproduction, now we're getting into some of the technical things. That's involving someone other than the individual or couple that plans to raise the child. Those would be intended parents. And it could include the use of donated eggs, donated sperm, or donated embryos, or the use of a gestational carrier, someone who has these days no genetic material in the arrangement, but is serving as a vessel to bring the child into the world for 9 months. Prior to IVF, more often you would see traditional surrogacy where the carrier's egg was fertilized in utero and she carried the child. We see less and less of those arrangements these days for a variety of legal as well as psychological reasons. It is probably easier for a gestational carrier to turn over a child in which she has no genetic connection than it would be if she were the one who produced the egg, and therefore that child was actually a part of her. Um, and so you see a significant reduction in the use of those traditional surrogacy arrangements. I want to give you some terminology because, as with most specialties, there's an alphabet soup of things which you will hear bandied about. I said before, ART, assisted reproductive technology, those are multiple technologies. IVF, as I said before, in vitro, IUI, intrauterine insemination, where, and this could take place with a husband or a partner's sperm, or it could take place with the donor's sperm. The goal here is to get the sperm as close to the egg as possible. And so with the use of a flexible catheter, which is sent intravaginally and through the cervix, semen is delivered that way. Donor insemination is just that. It is not the intended father's sperm which is being used. And this is also true for single women who wish to become parents, where there is no father in the way that we think about married fathers, or for same-sex couples where donor insemination would be necessary. When we get to same-sex couples who are male, it's even more complicated because you're missing two of the three parts. You need a donor egg and you need a womb to carry the child. ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, is a relatively new development in the field of infertility. I'd say about 20 years old. And ICSI, and I have a video which I didn't include in this talk, is quite remarkable because under the microscope, a single egg and a single sperm are put together. And then they are incubated as in traditional IVF. And in traditional IVF, multiple eggs and multiple sperm are placed inside a petri dish in a specific medium and kept at a specific temperature and allowed to do their own thing rather than be put together mechanically. So conceivably, no pun intended, higher rates of fertilization with ICSI. And certainly you can see it taking place. In the last 10 or 15 years, the technique of pre-implantation genetic testing has been developed. What happens with PGT is that at day 5, as the embryo is developing it to day 5, two or three cells are taken off of the outer layer of the embryo. The embryo is frozen, and those cells are sent off for genetic testing. And a variety of disorders can be determined this way. Typically, many clinics do something called PGTA, and that's checking for something called aneuploidy. If you can think about embryos in multiple ways, and one way would be to think about them as euploid or aneuploid. Euploid, EUPLOID, being the good ones or the better ones, and aneuploid being the less good ones. Ultimately, you'd like to transfer the better ones. And of course, you could use PGT for other things like determining the sex of a child, as well as any genetic disorders that that child might be carrying. DE, donor egg or donor embryo, and GC, gestational carrier. Interesting thing about donor embryo is that a couple may have produced multiple embryos, had all of the children they want, and do not want those embryos destroyed in any way. They would much rather have them come to life. And so they donate them to another couple. And while it is a beautiful thing, it is a complex thing because their children, should these embryos come to fruition and reach full term, their children will have full genetic siblings living elsewhere. You can ponder that for a minute and think about the complex nature of that. How do those children relate to one another? But that's not really the purpose of my talk today. But it is a complex and potentially beautiful thing. So where do the world religions fall on ARTs, all of these assisted reproductive technologies? So, and I'm just going to go through the list, which is set up alphabetically. The Anglican Church, which represents part of the church, which is very close to Catholicism, says that ARTs are allowed, and they don't really forbid anything. The notion of multifetal reduction is a problem in some religions. And what is multifetal reduction? When you transfer an embryo, today, the standard of care is to transfer a single embryo because transferring multiple embryos, which used to be done far more 25 or 30 years ago, is not as useful because number one, we're much better at doing it, so we don't have to put back a whole bunch hoping that one of them will take. And multiples are harder on mothers and they're harder on babies. So typically, when you're gestating multiples, the babies, twins typically come earlier and they typically are lower in birth weight. And higher order multiples, triplets, quads, quints, are even lower in birth weight and potentially come much earlier. Many of you may remember the story of the octomom, who the doctor, in his enthusiasm, transferred 8 embryos, assuming that not all of them will take, and lo and behold, 8 embryos came to fruition, and those kids were very low birth weight and spent a fairly long amount of time in the NICU. And so we think it's a bad idea. But every now and then, a single embryo transferred decides to split on its own. The problem is if one of those fetuses looks good and the other one does not, what do you do? Do you run the risk of the bad looking fetus doing damage to the good looking one? Do you run the risk of delivering one child that is not going to make it and one child that is? Or do you do multifetal reduction, which is essentially terminating the not good fetus so that the good fetus can thrive? It's a problem for many people because it is an abortion. Um, so, and you can see from the chart that in some places, it's really okay to do that. Judaism is particularly okay with multifetal reduction, and that has to do with when does the soul develop. Most of Buddhism, as you can see, most of the ARTs are just fine. Multifetal reduction, no, you can't do that. That's not an acceptable procedure. Interestingly, when you get down to Roman Catholicism, what you can see is that gamete interfallopian transfer, that's what, and it's a procedure which is rarely done, was acceptable. But everything else, so IVF, gestational carriers, donors, are not allowed, with the exception of artificial insemination within a married couple. And so the question has to do with why is Roman Catholicism so hard on the use of donors or gestational carriers when the tradition goes back to that first commandment to be fruitful and multiply. And as I'm fond of saying, Genesis, it doesn't say how you should be fruitful and multiply. It just says you should be fruitful and multiply. The church, the Catholic Church takes a very rigid view of this, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So why does Christianity object to ART when family creation is holy? Well, marriage is an image of the relationship between Christ and the church. And a medical intervention defaces this image. So every time we intervene technologically in something which is holy, we make it unholy. So IVF is a fertilization without the couple being involved. Scientists are now involved. And so that, in the church's view, destroys the notion of the sanctity of child creation through the marital bond. And in countries which are devoutly Catholic, you will find that it's not practiced. And certainly donors are not allowed. Um, and donors not allowed because it puts a third party into this unholy relationship. It could be viewed as incestuous or adulterous in many ways. And surrogacy does both of those things. It fertilizes without the couple being involved, and it uses a third party, which commodifies the child. So the child is the result of some financial transaction, which is less than holy, because for the most part, gestational carriers are compensated for their time. And ART makes the church anxious about innovations to the marital relationship. One wonders with the past pope and with the current pope if there will be changes in the way the church views this and becomes more liberal in regard to how families are created, how children are created. Islam is very interesting in this area. As you know, there are two primary branches of Islam, Sunni and Shia, and they take a different view. So the first fatwa about ART was 1980. So it's 2 years after Louise Brown, the first IVF baby, was born, and it took place within the Sunni division, primarily in Egypt. And it said IVF was okay because it relieved the couple of the pain of infertility and the threat to the marriage posed by infertility. So you can do IVF if you are Sunni, but you must use your own gametes, your own sperm and your own egg. You can't use a donor because lineage is critical to identity in Islam. Now, lineage is critical in Judaism as well, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in the Sunni division of the faith, only the couple's gametes may be used. Interestingly, adoption is not allowed. Though it's often practiced, the adopted child is not legally or morally part of the family, but because hospitality is a very important component in Islam, the child is brought in and afforded the protection of that hospitality, but kinship isn't created through an adoption in Islam. The first fatwa in the Shia version of Islam took place in 1999. So the Shia waited a long time. And so this is primarily in Iran. And what that fatwa said was that donated gametes were acceptable, but there were conditions placed on it. So the child only inherits from the donor to maintain the Shiite family integrity. So a couple can use a donor, but the child, as a result of that will not inherit from the family who raises that child, but from the family where the donor derived. So it changes things a little bit. Now, let me go back to that one. So an interesting problem arises for those who are Sunni and want to have a child. Do you go to another country and do you use a donor perhaps to do a workaround for this particular fatwa? And the answer is, as in most cases, yes, some people will do that. They will come to another country and then not tell the truth about how the child came to be. But we don't need to go too far with that. To focus on those of us who practice Judaism, we've got a much wider range, but we have lots of checks and balances and workarounds to deal with. IVF certainly is acceptable. We take seriously being fruitful and multiplying. PGT is okay. You can take that cell off and those two cells off and send them off to the lab for testing because the soul doesn't enter the body until 40 days of gestation. And remember, those cells are taken off at 5 days. Is selective reduction okay? Yes, if it saves a life. Saving a life is the most important thing within the context of Judaism. And so if selectively reducing a pregnancy saves the life of the fetus that would have been harmed by having that unviable fetus with it, then absolutely. In the same way that an abortion is acceptable if it saves the life of the woman carrying that child. Is embryo research okay? Because when you do research with embryos, those embryos are going to be destroyed. Well, if it promotes life, it's acceptable. And for the most part, embryo research does seek to find answers to questions about how to improve fertility, how to improve childbirth processing across the board. But using artificial insemination, even by the husband, has problems because the collection of semen requires masturbation. And if you will recall the story of Onan, who in a levirate marriage was supposed to provide a son to his deceased brother's wife, and he couldn't do it, so he spilled his seed. Coitus interruptus would be the technical term for that. He was struck dead for violating that. So now we come up with prohibitions against masturbation, which are derived from that story of Onan. But you have to produce the specimen in order to inseminate. So the workaround has become a special condom. And that special condom has a hole at the collar up at where the base of the penis would be, not at the tip. So it's possible for sperm to get out. And so it's possible that a fertilization could take place. It's a beautiful workaround. Artificial insemination with the husband's sperm is okay. Donor sperm is a private matter. And a non-Jewish donor is preferable because when the child is born, you're going to go to the mikveh and the child is going to be converted in that way. Easier to convert a non-Jewish donor. With a Jewish donor, you run the risk of having an adulterous or incestuous relationship take place because you can't be 100% sure of the father. We know who the mother is because that's where the baby's coming from, unless we're using a donor egg. Surrogacy is preferred with non-Jewish single women, and that's kind of a debatable point. It depends on who you talk to. For many things, particularly in the Orthodox community, which rabbi you consult with may produce a different answer. But a non-Jewish single woman makes it easier to convert the child because you're not entering into an adulterous relationship and because conversion becomes much easier. The child's status is determined by the mother's heritage, and the gestational carrier here is not considered the biological mother. She has no genetic material in that child, so therefore no biology. And again, as I said, if a Jewish surrogate were married, carrying another man's child could be seen as violating the prohibition of forbidden sexual unions. Now, in reality, a significant number of gestational carriers are married, and the guidelines are that any gestational carrier should have had a child of her own before entering into an arrangement where she brings someone else's child into the world. And there are a variety of reasons for this. And the one that's most often given is that it would be hard to ask a woman to give up a child she had carried if she had never had a child of her own. But if she has had a child of her own and is very clear that she's doing this for someone else, she knows what it's like to carry. She knows what it's like to give birth, and she's very clear that it's not hers. But if she's never had one, then you can imagine the emotional connection which could develop. There's also concern about a Jewish woman carrying an embryo created by another Jewish couple using a donor egg. You could think of multiple mothers, the biological mother, the gestational carrier, the intended mother, and this could lead to questions about a child's halachic status and lineage. And to avoid that, in the Orthodox community, you'll see a very different approach to this. Um, as I said before, substitute womb, there's no genetic connection here. And so we tend to think, Judaism tends to see the surrogate as an okay unit here because you're not going to question the child's genetic makeup. However, in the more Orthodox communities, it's a different story. Um, I'm going to move away from that embryos, and embryos are important here because you're transferring embryos, you're making embryos, you're transferring embryos, you're freezing embryos. Sometimes, if you've used all the embryos you want to have all the children you want, and they're leftover embryos, you now have to dispose of those embryos. And there are really only three choices. They can be donated to another family, they can be donated to research, or they can be thawed and allowed to expire. So if you thaw and allow to expire, if you give to research, that embryo will be destroyed. And so the possibility of life will be taken away. And this is the great construct that has been a problem. We most recently saw it in Alabama, where the state created a law which said you essentially they wiped out IVF and then we had to reverse it because embryos were going to be destroyed. There was no way around that. So if you look at the karmic traditions, um, consciousness is transmigrated. That's incarnation. And it takes place at conception. So if you destroy an embryo, you take on the burden of having killed. And that's not a burden one wants to take on. So in those traditions, embryo destruction is not allowed. Catholicism is very strict about this. The soul happens at the moment of conception. So the right to life begins then, hence the great difficulty that the Catholic Church has with any number of practices. And that's why you don't see it. You don't see the use of infertility treatments frequently taking place. I hate to do this, but I have to pause for 1 second and answer the door. Excuse me for a second.
Thank you all for being patient. We know life happens, even on Shavuot.
My Barbara, we should say that the screen's not, I'm gonna be done in 10 minutes, but screen door on the back porch, there's a screen that needs to be fixed. Okay, I'll catch up with you. Yeah. I'm so sorry. Um, so, and the last item, because embryos are frozen, and that can impact survival upon thawing. So there's some question here about, how sanctified is an embryo and how do we treat it? Embryos thaw really well. They thaw better than eggs. An egg is a single cell, an embryo is multiple cells, so it's an easier thaw process. And in fact, in the last couple of years, a child was born from an embryo that had been frozen for 24 years. There are other ways of viewing embryos. Protestant has this generationist doctrine that says that the soul derives from the parents in the process of procreation. Um, but personhood develops more gradually. So within that tradition, if you're doing research for treatment or to improve the life of future generations, it's acceptable in some circumstances to destroy an embryo. Some Hindu teachings say that incarnation takes place very, very late in gestation, so questionable there. And consciousness takes place progressively. So some Buddhist thinkers are utilitarians. They think that killing can be an expression of compassion with positive karmic consequences because something good will come out of the destruction of that embryo. the bottom line here is that when we look at the use of fertility treatments across multiple religions, nothing is ever simple. Even if we try and simplify things and say that you can't do any of this, um, people are going to try and find workarounds because the desire to reproduce, the desire to have the next generation, to be part of that, to parent, is a very powerful one. I want to share a variety of resources because there are significant Jewish resources for fertility issues. And they run the range from the more liberal, the Reform movement, all the way to the very Orthodox. And I'll just run through them a little bit with you. Hasida, which is out in Los Angeles, is run by a woman who is ordained at HUCJIR in Los Angeles. And it's an awareness organization. It helps to create and connect people with resources and will provide financial assistance for IVF. IVF is a very expensive process. The average cost for IVF these days is somewhere around $20,000 to $25,000, depending upon where you live. The Jewish Fertility Foundation, which is down in Atlanta and tends to be on the more liberal side of things, again provides financial assistance, awareness, emotional support, and has branches in multiple cities. There's one in DC. I think there's one out in Detroit as well as in Atlanta. Uprooted is a Boston-based organization that does advocacy and ritual creation, and it works with Jewish leaders to teach about how families can be helped with fertility challenges. PUA and ATIME are both Orthodox organizations that are very involved in the fertility field. PUA, and you'll recognize the name, it's one of the midwives, is headquartered in Israel, but it provides services around the world and has significant presence in the United States. And PUA looks very closely at halacha and helps couples to follow halachic traditions as much as possible. And we'll even go so far as to provide lab supervision. So an embryo is created. There is a member of PUA there to make sure that both the sperm and the egg came from Jewish parents, that there is no alteration of those. I think of it akin to the way that someone sits with the body at the funeral home and stays with it to make sure that nothing happens to that body so that it receives a proper religious burial. This is the reverse of that, making sure that the baby comes into the world having followed strict halachic procedures. ATIME is another organization which is focused almost exclusively on religiously observant Jews. Both ATIME and PUA will run workshops. They tend to be headquartered primarily New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, up that way. And then Yesh Tikva is another organization which does the same thing, and Yesh Tikva is a bit more liberal within the Orthodox community. And those are 6, I think, very useful organizations for Jews who are interested in and are struggling with issues of fertility. So I want to stop the share there. I've covered a lot of complex material, and I would be glad to entertain questions and answer them as best I can. I think Rabbi Slipikoff was in the room, and if he is there and can correct me on anything I've said wrong from a religious point of view, I'll certainly rely on him for that. But I would be glad to open it up to questions.
Would you like me to allow folks to unmute themselves? We have about 5 minutes or so for
Yeah, that'd
questions.
be great. Yeah, folks can unmute themselves and then I can hear their voices.
All right, feel free to do that or put a question in the chat or, use the raise hand function, however you prefer.
Do Orthodox Jews believe in prenatal testing? That's a really great question. And it's a question I don't think I can give you a really good answer to. My guess would be yes, because you're not destroying the embryo. Now, you would think, and I would suspect that genetic testing prior to creation of embryos would be something that would be important. Certainly, Tay-Sachs testing for that would be important in the Orthodox community prior to marriage, so that you would know if the partner you've chosen is a carrier or not. Rabbi Slipikoff, has entered the room, and I mentioned his name before. So that's the best answer I can give you right now. But it's a good question. I'll have to get you a better answer on that one. Okay. Well, seeing no more questions, let me thank you very much for your time today. If you do have questions, certainly you can email me. TI has my email address, and I'd be glad to speak with you.
Would you like me to put that in the chat?
Yeah, yeah, I can put it.
That works too. Thank you so much. That was such an informative presentation.